Yo, what's happening, everyone? So I need to tell you about what went down on First Take this morning because honestly, I was not prepared for where this conversation went and I'm still trying to process everything that was said. I had just woken up the day after Super Bowl 60, still recovering from all the excitement and chaos of watching the Seahawks beat the Patriots, made myself some coffee to shake off the hangover, turned on ESPN to see what the hot takes would be, and there were Stephen A. Smith, Shannon Sharp, and Mad Dog Russo getting ready to discuss the Las Vegas Raiders and their coaching situation with Clint Kubiak. But instead of just breaking down Kubiak's hiring or talking about Fernando Mendoza being the #1 pick, they pivoted into this absolutely wild discussion about whether the Raiders should be pursuing Jordan Addison from the Minnesota Vikings to give their young offense another explosive weapon. And man, the way this entire segment unfolded had me sitting there completely captivated because they were covering everything from the Raiders' need for playmakers to Kubiak's offensive scheme to whether trading assets for a player like Addison makes sense when you're trying to build a championship roster from scratch. Hey, what's up everyone? Before we dive into everything I have for you today, I need to share something real with you that would mean the absolute world to me. That subscribe button right there. Hitting it right now would bring me one step closer to my dream of reaching 1,000 subscribers. I know you're eager to get into all this content, but real quick, just smash that subscribe button and hit the notification bell. It's such a simple thing. It takes literally 1 second, but it's honestly the biggest way you can support this journey and help me reach that milestone. Trust me, every single subscription gets me closer to that goal. And honestly, it would mean everything to me. So do me that quick favor right now and be part of this dream becoming reality. The show opened in this really energetic way because instead of immediately jumping into the Jordan Addison discussion, Stephen A. started by absolutely celebrating Clint Kubiak and the Seahawks winning the Super Bowl. He had this excited look on his face and he goes, "Now listen, Clint Kubiak just won a Super Bowl as the offensive coordinator of the Seattle Seahawks, and now he's heading to Las Vegas to be the head coach of the Raiders. And this is exactly the type of hire that can change the trajectory of a franchise." And you could tell by his tone that he was genuinely excited about what this means for the Raiders. Stephen A. continued, "But here's my question for the Raiders and for their front office. What are you going to do to give Clint Kubiak the weapons he needs to be successful? Because you can have the best coach in the world, but if you don't have players who can execute the game plan and make plays, you're going to struggle." Shannon Sharp immediately jumped in, and he started breaking down the Raiders' offensive roster and identifying where they desperately need to upgrade. Shannon was talking about how the Raiders don't have nearly enough playmakers at the receiver position, how they're probably going to draft Fernando Mendoza with the #1 overall pick, and how they need to surround that young quarterback with weapons if they want him to succeed. Shannon made this really compelling point about how so many young quarterbacks fail in the NFL, not because they're not talented, but because they don't have anyone to throw the ball to, and the Raiders cannot make that mistake with Mendoza. Mad Dog came in absolutely fired up, and he was yelling about how the Raiders are in a perfect position to be aggressive this offseason, because they have cap space, they have draft picks, and they have a new head coach who's a proven winner. He brought up how Kubiak just won a Super Bowl with the Seahawks by being conservative and controlling the football, but he also showed he can design explosive plays when he needs to, and that's exactly what the Raiders need. Mad Dog was really emphasizing how the Raiders need to strike while the iron is hot and make moves that show they're serious about building a contender. Stephen A. brought the conversation specifically to Jordan Addison, and this is where things really got interesting. He started breaking down Addison's situation in Minnesota and why he would be such a perfect fit for what the Raiders are trying to build. Stephen A. was talking about how Addison is only 23 years old and already has proven he can be productive at the NFL level, how he creates separation with his route running and makes plays after the catch, and how those are exactly the skills that young quarterbacks need from their receivers. Stephen A. was really emphasizing how if the Raiders are going to draft Fernando Mendoza, they need to give him a legitimate #1 receiver who can win on the outside, and Addison could be exactly that guy. Shannon jumped back in and started talking about the fit from a scheme perspective and why Jordan Addison would thrive in Clint Kubiak's offensive system. He was breaking down how Kubiak's offense in Seattle was predicated on controlling the line of scrimmage with the run game and then taking shots downfield when defenses loaded the box, and how Addison's ability to stretch the field vertically would be perfect for that kind of system. Shannon made this point about how Kenneth Walker won Super Bowl MVP by dominating on the ground, but when they needed to make plays through the air, Sam Darnold had weapons he could trust, and that's what the Raiders need to build for Mendoza. Mad Dog interrupted, and he started talking about the youth element and why the Raiders desperately need to get younger and more explosive on offense. He was explaining how the Raiders have been one of the slowest and most boring offenses in the NFL for years, how they need to inject some speed and playmaking ability into their roster, and how adding a 23-year-old receiver like Jordan Addison would be a great place to start. Mad Dog was making this point about how when you're rebuilding, you want to add players who are on the same timeline as your young quarterback, and Addison fits that perfectly. Stephen A. came back and started talking about what it would actually cost to acquire Jordan Addison from Minnesota. He was speculating about different trade packages, talking about how maybe it would take a second-round pick, or maybe a second and a third, or maybe the Raiders could package some of their later picks to move up and get him. Stephen A. was being realistic about the fact that the Vikings aren't just going to give away a talented young receiver for nothing, but he was also saying that Addison's value might not be as high as it could be because of some off-field issues and inconsistent production. Shannon got back in there and he started talking about the contract situation with Jordan Addison and why it makes financial sense for the Raiders. He was explaining how Addison is still on his rookie contract, which means they'd be getting a talented receiver at a team-friendly price, and how that kind of value is exactly what rebuilding teams need. Shannon made this point about how the Raiders are going to have to pay Fernando Mendoza eventually when his rookie contract is up, so adding other young talented players on rookie deals now gives them flexibility to build a complete roster. Mad Dog jumped in and started talking about the risk versus reward calculation of trading for Jordan Addison, given his off-field concerns. He was explaining how Addison has had a DUI arrest and some other incidents, but at the end of the day, he's still a talented young player who can help you win games. Mad Dog was making this point about how sometimes you have to take calculated risks on players with some red flags if you believe in their talent, and the Raiders with a strong veteran presence and a disciplined coach like Kubak could be the perfect environment to help Addison mature. Stephen A. then shifted the conversation to talk about Fernando Mendoza and how adding Jordan Addison would specifically help the rookie quarterback's development. He was breaking down how Mendoza is known for being accurate and making smart decisions, but he needs receivers who can create separation and make his job easier. Stephen A. was explaining how having Addison as a legitimate #1 receiver would take so much pressure off Mendoza and allow him to just focus on executing the offense rather than trying to force the ball into tight windows. Shannon came back and he made an interesting point about the Raiders coaching staff and how they're going to build their offensive system. He was talking about how Andrew Janovich is expected to be the offensive coordinator, how he's followed Kubak everywhere and knows exactly how he wants to run the offense, and how that continuity is going to be important for implementing their scheme. Shannon was arguing that adding a receiver like Jordan Addison who fits what they want to do offensively would accelerate the installation process and help Mendoza get comfortable faster. Mad Dog started getting animated again, and he was talking about the Max Crosby situation and how that factors into whether the Raiders should be aggressive in adding offensive weapons. He was explaining how there are all these trade rumors around Crosby, how Ian Rappaport just reported that Crosby and the team are in a good place despite the speculation, and how keeping Crosby on defense while adding offensive playmakers would show the team is serious about winning. Mad Dog was making this point about how you can't just rebuild on one side of the ball, you need to improve your entire roster. Stephen A. brought up the Super Bowl and how watching Clint Kubak's game plan against the Patriots should give Raiders fans confidence. He was talking about how Kubak showed he can adjust his game plan based on the situation, how he was conservative because he trusted his defense to get stops, and how when he needed to make plays through the air, they did it. Stephen A. was explaining how that kind of adaptability is exactly what the Raiders need from their head coach, and adding weapons like Jordan Addison would give Kubak more options to be creative. Shannon jumped back in and started talking about the timeline of when all of this could happen. He was explaining how Kubak just won the Super Bowl yesterday and is probably going to be officially announced as the Raiders head coach today or tomorrow, how the Raiders are behind some other teams in their coaching and roster building process, and how they need to move quickly to start making improvements. Shannon was arguing that trading for Jordan Addison could be one of the first major moves they make to show they're serious about building a winner. Mad Dog came back and he was talking about what the Raiders receiving core would look like if they successfully acquired Jordan Addison. He was painting this picture of having Addison as the #1 receiver, bringing in some veterans on cheap deals to provide depth, and maybe drafting another receiver in the later rounds to develop. Mad Dog was making this point about how that kind of receiving room would give Fernando Mendoza multiple options and wouldn't put too much pressure on any one player. Stephen A started talking about the fan base reaction and how Raiders fans are desperate for the team to make aggressive moves. He was explaining how Raiders fans just watched their division rival Seattle win the Super Bowl with Clint Kubiak as their offensive coordinator, and now they're getting that same coach, and they want the front office to give him the tools to succeed. Stephen A was arguing that trading for Jordan Addison would energize the fan base and show them that the organization is committed to winning.